Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 25. In this episode, I'm talking to Scott Drawer. Scott doesn't have a motorsports background himself, but he was responsible for bringing McLaren Formula One into the world of British Olympic sports. In this show, we discuss the power of performance planning and how that's helped teams such as Team Sky and England Rugby succeed at the very highest level. He puts to bed some of the myths around marginal gains and gives you several tips and ideas that you can try and improve your performance in ways that may not be immediately obvious to you. Scott covers a lot of ground in a short space of time, so get yourself comfortable, grab a notepad and a coffee, sit back and enjoy what Scott has to say. So welcome, Scott.
Welcome, Samir.
How are you?
Yeah, very well. Been a busy term, but other than that, all good.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's a really busy time, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's a slightly different angle, your experience, and I think people will be really fascinated to hear what you've been up to, the kind of people you work with, and how you've approached your career in working with athletes and sport. But one of the things that would be really helpful is if we can work towards a way that people listening can get like maybe one or two takeaways for how they can approach their own racing in motorsports. Yeah, they can think, okay, that's how these guys have approached, and what can we learn? But maybe there's one or two things in there that they hadn't thought of before. They could take away and go, yeah, actually, I'm going to try that and give that a go. I never thought of it that way. How does that sound?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that makes sense. So do bring me back in online if it doesn't get towards that perspective of trying to give some people practical things to take away. But I think one of the things that may be worth just starting with to help people understand my career journey, and like most people, you never know what that career journey is going to be. But I've been very fortunate to work in sport, mainly high performance sport, for more than 20 years.
Where did you start in sport though? Were you an athlete yourself? Were you a competitor?
If I wind all the way back, really, I followed sports science in my education program, ended up doing a PhD at Loughborough University. It was very much about risk, the concept of risk in sport, particularly around injury risk, injury management. But I've always had a passion and love for sport. Probably more a generalist. I was never brilliant at one sport, played lots to a good regional level, but just never excelled in any, really, because I think you do get to a particular point in your life where you need to zoom down on a main sport, invariably, to put the time, effort, hours and the dedicated practice to achieve whatever it is that you've got in your locker, to be some senses. So after my PhD, I entered the UK, United Kingdom Olympic Paralympic system as it was, very early 2000, which looks nothing like it does now. So it was like a startup is the way I describe it. I went into a role, had a strong statistical, mathematical background. And believe it or not, the PhD was very epidemiological based.
What's that?
Epidemiology is where you study population statistics. So very statistical driven in that basis, really. So we were doing that, trying to study and understand risk patterns in professional football. And that was driven by my supervisor, who came from the health and safety industry. And often what people didn't realize is a professional club, and it was in professional football, in theory, have to adhere to health and safety regulation. So you never think about a professional footballer ultimately as an employee. And therefore, you need your health and safety processes in place. You need to be measuring and understanding risk and putting mitigation in place. It's no different to what happens in motorsport, really. But it's a professional football. You understand what those injury risk factors are through epidemiology. And then because you would apply good sports science practice to manage and mitigate against them, that's where my background came in with my supervisor. So that's where it all started. I went into an Olympic system, as I say, which really stemmed from, I guess, where was it? The original plan for the British Olympic system was to have a massive centre, the Australian Institute for Sport. They realised that wasn't right for the UK. We ended up with a very devolved sort of system of lots of services, lots of centres based where athletes were. So I came in at that time. It's very startup mentality. Lottery funding was coming into sport and enabled athletes to live and train full time. And the first impact of that was really Sydney 2000, and then it moved on, and all we've seen is an upward growth. And then that system's become a lot more sophisticated. So I started even before the English Institute for Sport was even existed as it currently did. As I evolved through that startup, in some respects, I ended up leading what became known as research innovation. We'd take on project work with sports, and a big emphasis of that work ended up being quite engineer and technology focused. And really my role, the best way is a bit like describing, I used to say, a bit like the conductor of an orchestra. Sport would come in And they'd say, we've got these problems and we don't know how to do this. And it was a two-way process. God, we've seen this. What do you think? And my job was to put that orchestra together. So to find the most talented individuals there were who had the right skills and expertise to work together to solve those problems. And a lot of it was engineering and tech focused. And when you take a step back at that time, I just probably realized that Motorsport Valley, as it was known, the amount of British talent and how evolved Formula One and motorsport was relative to some of our other sports meant you just tap into that expertise. So I led a whole whack of projects really up and up into London, and you contributed to some of those things.
A small
well,
one.
Yeah, I mean, a big period of time of developing a team. We would talk about having a very small, fast-moving speedboat of a team, but we had this network of thousands, and we were able to react and respond really quickly, rather than employing your own, often, which means it can get quite slow. You talk about the supertanker analogy. We would use the expertise outside, contract people in, understand problems, try to provide solutions, and then move on. And of course, that's a constant evolving learning process. It's very organic in terms of what you do. So I then moved to work in England Rugby. I really needed a change at that time, which is, again, a very different career experience working in player development. And the RFU, when you work really in a national governing body, is big. It's big and cumbersome. In fact, it was much slower than working for government in that sense. So you learn a lot of different skills around how you take people with you, really. You're relying on others and stakeholders, and a lot around stakeholder management and just building good trusting relationships with others. It happened previously, but it was very different. And then I had a unique opportunity. I was never planning on, as you do invariably, leaving those roles, but a great opportunity to go back and work directly with Team Sky in professional cycling. And initially I went in to work with the CEO of Sky and Sir Dave Brailsford, and they were really looking at what they were doing in Team Sky. How can they learn those lessons about how they approach winning bike races? What are the key things they can learn that will benefit sport in general? Everything from participation through to high performance, but other domains. So music, art, entertainment, all those, what's going on and how can we learn from one another? So it became the concept of the Sky Performance Hub, which is very multi-domain, multi-dimensional. We were going through some challenging times at Team Sky at that time, and I ended up, with other people leaving, I ended up getting embedded a lot more in the team and picking up a lot more of the science medicine programs and working on the innovation of lots of other things. So in some respect, I was in a team rather than a national governing body in a system, and we were trying to do it in a very different way, really driving what we needed to do.
Those ideas of marginal gains and things like that, that's something that's been quite popularised.
Yeah, and actually I did a presentation for the United Kingdom Sport Strength and Conditioning Association about that, because it's a really misunderstood concept, actually. People think about marginal gains in relation to those 1%ers, but actually that's always an outcome of a number of things. And what people never saw or never experienced was the level of thought process, planning, dynamism and art went into thinking about how you're going to win a bike race. There's marginal gains was the consequence of really good performance planning. So in those early days, if you're trying to win a Tour de France, being able to map in as much detail as possible about what you need to do. So it's really about effective performance planning and thinking about all those factors, things you can measure, things you can't measure, thinking about where you were at that moment in time relative to what's going to be needed to do it, putting plans in place, managing the risks. And in effect, it was planning and contingency. And then realizing that no plan realistically survives the first contact with the enemy, and then having what contingency you had in place to react and respond. You needed a performance plan, you needed to triage, and then you needed to move really bloody quickly to respond to what's playing in front of you. And that is marginal gain. That's what it was. Everyone thought it was about the set of interventions. But what had gone in place, if I imagine you did your performance planning and you're thinking, what do? We've got to go to a Tour de France. We're trying to win this. The parcours or the course looks this particular way. It may say, actually, this year there's a lot of time trials, or this year there's a lot of mountain climbs, or there's these types of stages. So you begin to break that thinking down, and therefore you get to a point of saying what's important. You prioritize, because you can't do everything all the time.
How do you prioritize what is important? Because it's quite often, I had someone on the show, everything's important most of the time or something like that. It's like, it's context driven.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you got to imagine it a bit like an amplifier. So marginal gains is always about performance planning, prioritization. And the reality is there is an art and the skill to deciding where you're going to invest your time and effort. You cannot escape the equation that there's only so much time and there's so much money. And what you're trying to decide is which dials are you going to decide to dial up? And there's a real skill in that, but experienced coaches, experienced leaders, guys to Dave Brailsford, other people that I work with, they read and understand those situations. There's a real depth of tacit knowledge, if they call it, of insight. You've got great DSs, great coaches around. And what people don't see is the dialogue that goes on, the constant dialogue all the time around trying to navigate that uncertainty, which is ultimately what you're trying to do, to decide we're going to put our eggs in these baskets. Because if you think you can do everything all the time to the level of depth and quality that's going to enable you to compete, you can't. The reality is you cannot. So marginal gains has always been about planning, thinking about where you got to get to. And then it's about that dynamic process of change. And you have to make some decisions. And the really good people decide consistently. If you look at those, if I take an example of Jürgen Grobler, who's won an Olympic gold medal, I think the record is in every 4 that he's coached since the 70s. And that's different crews, different individuals, different cultures, different contexts. You got to think there's some tacit knowledge and insight and understanding there about what it takes to win, which became this language used in the Olympic system. It became a very dogmatic process of that. What people missed in that, the dialogue that goes on behind it, the real trust that enables conversations to be had.
If someone's listening, they think, okay, I get that. But if I want to take what you just said there and apply it to my environment, maybe I've got a small team around me. I might have I'm not in a huge organization. I've got a few people and I've got limited time and I've got a limited budget, but I'd like to focus on something. So have you got any tips for navigating those conversations? Is it all natural, like you and me talking now? Or is there some structure you put into those things? Or is it like, oh, we've got to have a meeting? What is it? What do they look like?
There's no right or wrong way. You need, in effect, the way I describe this, you need a big toolbox and a big network. So one of the things that you need to do, which I reflect back on in my time in the Olympic sport, we spent a lot of time meeting people and building these connected networks of expertise. Because when something comes up, a situation comes up that you've never faced before, what you wanted to do is have a consultation, be able to pick the phone up, like, I'm facing this situation, what do you think? And I think what you end up doing is in effect surfacing the wisdom of the crowd. Because if you haven't been there before and others don't, it comes back to that expert opinion. And then, of course, you've got to make the final decision. And there may be a gut feel about what you think is right. But if everyone knew the answer, you wouldn't be asking the question.
And this is something that when I first started working in the sport, I was really shocked. I was going to some conferences and stuff, and people were literally standing up and telling people in detail exactly what they did. And for me, coming from a motorsport world, that was really weird because it was literally, don't tell anyone this because this is our secret sauce and this is giving us an advantage. And if they do ask, tell them the wrong thing. But what I love about the sport world is like, I'm going to tell you everything you're doing because it's not about that. It's about the execution. And it's also about if we can all pool the knowledge, that the pond rises or the whole gene pool gets better. Yeah. And that's still really quite alien in motorsport.
Of course, you do get that in some of the sports that I've worked in, having not worked in F1. You will get a lot of that. But the reality is you spend time in it, you realize everyone's trying to do the same stuff. Got real desperate, on occasions people have maybe, it's not that they've got something different and been able to move a bit faster. The thing that makes a difference is it's not the knowledge and knowing it. As you said, it's about your ability to take it and implement it faster than anybody else. There is a great quote I often refer to, a guy called Arius de Use, and he talks about the only sustainable competitive advantage you can maintain is to learn faster than the opposition. And if you therefore hold your knowledge and hold your experiences and are not vulnerable enough in that sense to share them, you're missing an opportunity. So you have to be comfortable enough in that to be able to do that. And you've got to be comfortable enough in your own skin to know that you cannot be the fountain of all knowledge. If you look at the emergence of technology, knowledge sharing, what's on the internet, all that stuff, you're just like, if you think you're further ahead than anybody else, I can assure you there's somebody else in a garage somewhere or another competitor nation that are on a similar journey. It's just, of course, you do get occasions when there's fundamentally a revolutionary breakthrough. But I think we'll all look at those and go, oh, maybe it was this time, maybe it was that time. And it's just, they don't happen that often. So I think that does come with a mindset of being open to learn and feeling, I'm going to share this. I'm going to put it out there. And the fact where I'm going, that's okay. Because the difference is not about, I am going to make a decision that's contextually relevant for me based on where I'm at in my development, based on my networks, my connections. I've sought that advice. And ultimately, at some point, you have to make a decision. Sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, it's great because you learned something. They would talk about, I'll use them, but failed first attempt in learning. Yeah, that's how, if you keep winning and you keep successful, you do have an ingredient set. But if often that may mean you're playing safe.
Okay, so how do you manage that? Because there's some issue. So, for example, if you change the settings of your race car, it's going to affect the performance potential of what you can do. And people are certainly in a club environment a bit nervous to do that, or they're not really sure what to do. And what some people have been telling me, on the show and stuff, is that what you need to do is just try it and experiment. And even if you go slower, it's still good because you now know what not to do, sort of thing. Even if you do 10 things that make you go slower, that's a benefit.
Yeah.
And it's like a mind shift in that, to have the confidence to do that. Is that something you would say? Is that what you're saying?
If you knew the answers, you'd already be doing it. You've got to put some context and purpose behind this, haven't you? Like, if I take your example of club racing, I'm thinking, it's not like you're trying to win an Olympic medal, is it? You're not trying to win a Formula One race. And that, but even then, you've got to put it in context. There's a bigger picture here. There's stuff going on in the world. So I think that there's got to be a context to all of this stuff. And that's invariably, if you take an Olympic coach, let's take a sport like canoe slalom, you're on a 4-year journey, you're constantly experimenting. You may have a training program you try for 8 weeks and you see a response. You try the same training program for the next 8 weeks, you don't get a response. There's so much going on that we do not understand that you have to empirically test and experiment repeatedly to move forward. And that's where the shared knowledge, I tried this in this context and this is what worked for me. If you just take somebody else's training program and replicate it in a completely different context with somebody who's got a completely different genetic makeup, is in a completely different country with a different competitive structure, you're wrong. And I think it's really recognizing that, as I say, be open-minded to it. Everybody's where they're at, engage, connect, try things. That's how you move forward.
I think there's possibly a misconception that there's like in the racing world or whatever, or even in cycling, there's one best setup that we're chasing, and that's what all the pros have got. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is not necessarily, because we're amateurs, but we can still take a professional approach. So we may not be professionals, but there's a professional approach. So what is the approach that the professionals take that we could then pick and choose of how to solve our own problems by looking at those approaches?
No, I would agree. It's interesting in my current role, and I'm in a private independent school which is renowned for sport, a place called Millfield School. And I would talk about here, we're very fortunate to have a number of students who have, in fact, Lando Norris came here. We've got some other guys that go and race because of the flexibility of the way we educate, so people can develop in their sport through there, which is an interesting one.
Funny you mentioned Lando. I had Lando Norris's performance psychologist on in show 1. He was show 1. Wow. Yeah, I know. He's a great guy, and he's just started racing himself. Yeah. So that was putting his money where his mouth is. Yeah, so I was talking about that sort of the planning and the professional approach, choosing to take a more professional approach. But the question is, so people are, okay, this is my passion. I love this sport and I go to work to pay for it, but and I'm never going to win maybe, but I still love it. I'd just like to know how I can be more professional or take a more professional approach.
Yeah, and I guess where I was going to with the comment I made here is often we will have young, talented individuals who, I guess our job here is to provide what I'd call a performance experience. That may not be there. There may not be some natural innate ability to get there, or you don't have, and that's just the reality. There's only so many people. But we want to provide an experience that helps provide the right challenge and development environment. So when you talk about that professional approach, you can look at what other people are doing that may be full-time and it is their job, if that's what we define as, and therefore they can spend more time and effort on it. What systems and processes can you put in place to take that as well? And it's the same in all levels of sport, to be honest, particularly around how that's emerged. But I think that's a really good approach. You can learn about how people go about their role as opposed to what they do. And a lot of it is about that. It's about how you go about it. And taking that very process-driven approach is the right one, because the reality is, in many cases, particularly in sport, the reason why we love it is this unpredictability. And you can control what you can control. But if Usain Bolt turns up and you're in the 100 meters and somebody's got some genetic gift, there's nothing you can do about those scenarios. So I think there's a big thing around the mindset of thinking like that.
So what's a win for you? Because this is something that we talk. There's a lot of glum faces in the motorsport paddock, and there can't be cars or whatever in a race, and there's just one winner and a couple of podium places. And how would you define a win in terms of that? For example, now for me, a win is getting on the starting grid, because there's so much time and energy and organisation and moving things around to even get to the position where your car is sitting on the grid, ready to go. For me, that's a win. how would you define it? Is that the right way to think about it? Is that something you've experienced as well? That like win every day kind of mentality?
Yeah, about being better. So actually, there's some interesting things that underpin this. And if you go back, there's some great research around studying individuals that have been super successful in many industries, particularly in sport. And there's lots of characteristics you may see in those individuals, which are the psychosocial things. And interestingly, so just as an example, there was some work done on what I call multiple medalists in Great British Sport, those that went on and did it again and again. And there were some characteristics for them that just showed that it was as much about being better every day as being able to put your game face on when it mattered. And there were some subtle changes in those that they may be trained with, and those individuals and athletes that they train with who were successful, national, international level, but never quite made it. The mindset was too much focused on the outcome, less about what you're doing every day. And it was, so that ability to really focus on changing things every day, getting those little wins are the things that you can control. And then, of course, they could put the game face on when it really mattered. They had all the prerequisites and they could compete. But there's a subtle difference in that mindset. And I guess in that, it's an obsessive compulsive nature of wanting to improve all the time. And therefore, you have a lot more control of what's happening with you. And that is a mindset piece. So I would agree, everyone's win looks a little bit different. And there's a real skill, and I think you mentioned about Lando's psychologist that would have worked with him. And there'll be similar, I suspect, what you'll see. I'm not a psychologist, so they will work with athletes and helping find those things that are, it's smart goal setting, isn't it, really? As simplistic as it sounds, but putting some realism to it. There is a different, Dave Brailsford will talk about the difference between goals and dreams. And I think those are that's the things that you have to be realistic about. But your goals are something that you can manage within the realism of what you have. And that's a success for you, isn't it? And I think that will give you a success. So when you go back again, you think, what's realistic next time?
If you set a goal as, I want to win this, is that wrong or is that right? Because that's outside of your control to a large degree.
It is, and it comes back with the realism of that, isn't it? So everything's context important. If you had a lot more resources and I'm going into the same race as you and I'm not doing it in and around my garage, and there may well be a different realistic perspective on it. So I think, it is. And that's where a coach-athlete relationship is really important. That's where having a network of mentors is important, because I think you need that to get that right. So it is so context specific. If you set that goal and you don't have, in your case, the equipment or been able to put the realities, the contact hours and the training and practice into it, you're setting yourself up to fail. And that's why there's got to be some realism in that and about what's a win for you. And that's where the best sports psychologists and the types of relationships you may have with others, mentors, other networks around you are really important to get that right.
So the interesting thing about motorsport traditionally, and I do think it's changing a little bit, but it has been this sport that hasn't really had coaches.
Yeah.
And so I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on coaches and coaching, and even a definition of what you would describe as a coach. But I don't really know why. Maybe it's something to do with machoism or, heroism, and I'm just braver than you, and the brake pedal's just for, coming into the pit, so I don't use that. And, there's something about a bravery element I don't know what it is. I don't know, there's something in there that has meant that people, traditionally the sport has not had, you talk about a car, and the car can be rubbish and blah, 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 but the driving and the driver and his mental or her mental approach or way of thinking is something you just have to sort that out on your own. That's traditionally how it's been. And if you're asking for help, you're remedial in some way. Whereas I think in sport, it's slightly different. It's a bit like, it's an advantage to have someone with expertise who can talk to you.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, as I said, I don't think anybody's ever the fountain of all knowledge. Whatever you call it, whether it's a coach, mentor, and all those types of characteristics, having somebody independent to your way of thinking, and they will have different skill sets. Coaching looks different across different ages and different sports. There's executive coaching in business. There's all those elements of it. Fundamentally, it's about getting the best out of others. And I think there's got to be a level of self-awareness first off, where you recognize others can bring something to something to you. And sometimes that's built on some credibility. If I started karting and I'm picking up the phone to Samir because you have some insight into that, I'm seeking your technical expertise, and coaching relationships change. So sometimes thinking of it at that, like, I want to access somebody's technical know-how, But I think the way I view coaching is much about getting the best out of you as a person. And it's all the other skills that help you to be the best you can be, not just in your sport, but in life. And those things is a much bigger context. And I think they do cross over really well. So coaching is as much about the technical as it is about the development of you as an individual, your mindset, your focus, and all of those things. And because it's hard to measure, so I'm going to say, engineering is a very deterministic, measurable objective. There is another quote which I just throw in: everything that we can measure doesn't really matter, and everything that matters we sometimes can't measure. So I think there's a recognition sometimes around what goes on above the neck. Sometimes we forget, and we cannot. The power of your thought process, your desire, your ability to control your emotions, all of those characteristics are fundamental to you being successful as an individual. I don't think that's up for debate. So it's just a culture, particularly in engineering, in your perspective, it is very deterministic, because you have simulation models, you have every individual factor which influences race time. But I could have the best car, but I rock up and I don't really want to race. I don't have my game face on, and the start goes off and I'm a little bit off because of I'm not heightened and I'm not ready to go, and my adrenaline. There's all of those things which you can't miss. I think for anybody to achieve their best, having a coaching culture, I think is a fundamental, if you went into any of those, is a fundamental element of being successful in whatever you do.
And what about nerves? Because even me sitting on the grid in my club race, such as it is now, on a wet and windy field somewhere in the UK that no one's ever heard of, I'm sitting on the grid. So I've had my win because I'm on the grid, but I'm really nervous because the lights are going out. Do professional athletes get nervous, and how do they manage that in a way that it doesn't necessarily affect their performance? Is there anything that we can do?
Brilliant question. I didn't tee this one up for you. So this week we had a parents and sport webinar on pressure. And we were really fortunate to a psychologist called Katie Warner, who's amazing. She's one of the most outstanding psychs I've worked with. She works in rugby and GB hockey. She's worked at Olympic sports and loads of different domains. We had a guy called Tom Mitchell. Tom was England and Great Britain sevens captain. And we had a lady called Rhiannon Fox, who dance and drama. So for performing arts. And we were exploring this area, or I'll call it pressure as a privilege. Katie gave me a brilliant video to play of a number of athletes who talk about the positive thing that comes from pressure. And of course, as a young developing athlete or a young student here at the school that I'm in, who's got exams, you got peer pressures, you got all of those things, how do you get to a point where you view it as a real positive? And there were some real key messages there that doubt, worry, stress is normal. That is the way our physiology works. So normalizing it, your pressure, I can assure you, if you're feeling nervous, so will everybody else. So that there comes with that. And so we were exploring ways that you try to get to a position where, an Olympic medalist will talk about viewing that. And again, it's sometimes reframing it. A lot's about you're pressurized because you think you're trying to achieve the expectations of others. And actually all the others want you to do is to do well. So there's lots of reasons why that may emerge. So I think that's where a coach and psych can really help normalize those things. Because actually the reality is the neurophysiology, that's just a normal response. Your heart's going to beat a bit faster. You're going to get a bit sweaty, as Eminem says. Those are all characteristics. And so it's always remembering why you're doing those things. And invariably, why people do sports is because they love it. They got a real passion for it. And sometimes that's where you got to connect to your reasons why you're there and get into a point where you get great joy out of it, you love doing it, you've prepared as good as you can. All of those things can help manage it. Breathing skills, I think that would have been something that would have been overlooked. Mindfulness, breathing. What's a breathing skill? Because there's some physiology where you do overactivate the vagal nerve. You can overactivate all your physiology, and particular ways of breathing can help manage that in the moment. But that needs practice. So I think the answer to your question is pressure, stress needs to be normalized. There are skills, methods, and techniques that you can use to help you better control that. And therefore, when it comes, you've got a way of, when you're going to race, you're thinking about the process you're going to deliver, as opposed to the outcome. If you focus on the outcome and the other things, you're thinking too far ahead. So there are skills that are coachable and trainable when it comes to your mindset and approach, which is where a coach can really help you. And if you're not willing to accept that, then you're always going to be leaving a performance advantage on the side.
If you're self-coaching, is there something you could do with that? Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think coaching is the first element of coaching, self-awareness. The fact you're able to recognize those situations is really important. I guess your self-awareness of those situations. And again, the coach may ask you the questions that help make you self-aware. Whereas you just accept them as being normal, actually, or not normal, they're able to say, yes, they are normal. And so you heighten your awareness around some of your physiological responses, your thought processes, everything that's going on. Yes, you can. So that is the first stage of coaching. But then you have somebody who's independent to you, has got really great questioning skills or experiences where they can help unpick it. So if you create a really good dialogue where there's trust, you're able to explore and go down those rabbit holes, and that will raise your awareness about what that looks like. And then you get into a stage of saying, so what can I do to manage it? And then you can look at some of those where whatever, there's no single solution for everybody in that sort of sense, but you can manage them. And I think that's where a really good coach, and that's where having a network of others, if you reach out to your fellow drivers and you were to say, do you get nervous? And they say, yeah, I do. This is what I've tried for me. And you ask somebody else and he says, well, this is what's worked for me. So is there a willingness to have that conversation anyway, admit it, because they may think it's a sign of weakness and actually it's not, it's a sign of strength. And then what do they do? Because as you say, you're never the fountain.
There's a paddock where before your race, you go to like a collecting area. So it's like a buffer effectively during the race before, typically, or some period of time before the race, so that you're ready when the current race finishes, you can go out. And there's a bit of a running joke in the sense of the different tracks you go to, how close is the nearest toilet to, get really run off to the loo.
Yeah. And actually those environments, the warm-up environments, as you may have in other sports, the holding pens are opportunities in some respects as well, that in your practice, if you're not practicing those things, you may then get on the grid if you come out if you haven't thought about it and planned for it, and the way you race means you don't integrate those, where it's the norm, I'm trying to normalize it. The first time you go into it, of course, it's going to feel like that. And so that comes back to that concept of performance planning, really thinking about the detail around actually in the holding pen environment. If I'm there for this amount of time, how have I prepared for it to ensure that when I get in my car, I'm ready to race? Because if I'm over anxious and I've got heightened awareness, and it means I hit the accelerator too quickly and I ram somebody up, or I'm trying to downplay it too far so I don't play that. There's all of those things. So that comes back to that principle of what's a marginal gain in that. It's not such a marginal gain, is it? That comes back to your planning process. You experiencing it and prioritizing the fact that actually I need to get that right. I need to think about it. I need to practice it. I need to try some skills to do it. And then you try something and it works one time, it doesn't work one time. Like those are the behavioral things you have to coach. Yeah, I would be planning and I would be practicing that thing in my race in advance whenever I go and practice, and I'll be trying to recreate it as much as I can. Of course, the question then is, can you ever truly recreate competition? Some would say yes or no in different sort of scenarios, but that comes down to really good coaching, really good planning, all of those scenarios. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, like anything.
Yeah. So you're practicing every element of the performance, not just the bit you do on the track.
Yeah, absolutely. The moment you get up, the quality of sleep before the big race, people will be nervous. That's just real. That's reality. How are you getting ready for that? You need to think about that running. It's like a time motion process that for some, that's the way you need to think about it.
Is there any tips for getting a good night's sleep the night before a big event?
I think the reality is, as we know, before a big event anyway, you are going to get less sleep. So I think you got to think about that in the running and make sure you've had enough sleep in the days building up to it.
So you sort of buffer your sleep there?
So it's not going to guarantee it. So everyone reacts to it in a slightly different way. For some people, it may be a really calm night in the sense that, but you're going to compete. It's game day. You're putting your game face on. There's all those things that you want to do your best. Comes back to that pressure scenario. What are you trying to achieve in this one particularly? It's what you've got control of. If you do everything you can control, that's the stuff that you got to think about as opposed to the uncontrollable, and focus on your process and what you need to do to achieve your best. There's a brilliant psychologist called Michael Gervais. He runs a brilliant podcast about performance, but he interviews lots of people. So he's got a brilliant definition of performance, and he's got two axes. And the y-axis at the top, it says world's best, and at the bottom, it says personal best. And on the x-axis, you've got outcome, and on the far side, process. So if you have to plot yourself, if you imagine that 4-box matrix, and you ask people what performance is, unsurprisingly, probably most, and just listening to you, I'm second guessing, most people go top right. It's about outcome and it's about being world's best. And of course, on game day, it may well be. But in your training and your preparation, of which you spend 99.9% of it, you may go the other extreme, which is it's about process and about personal best. So every day, you may do 1 rep extra. There's something else that shows progress, but it's about what you're doing to contribute to that thing on race day. And that's where the planning process comes in. You've really thought about all the things that are going to make a difference when you've got that race or that preparation. And therefore, what you build up in your plan, that's where it comes back to your decision making. Right, I've got this much time, this much money. What am I going to spend time and effort on? And I'm going to dial up this dial, this dial, this dial. And then we're going to go out and play it out. And that's where I focus. And every day, if I'm just trying to get stronger, God, I'm seeing that progress. And that's a personal win. That's internally, the internal motivation in the drive will say, I'm moving in the right direction. Because there's so many things that impact that outcome. And so if you think about a performer and performance in that light, personal best, world's best, and you think about it as outcome and process, you got to recognize that's a dynamic matrix that you're floating around. But 99.9% of your time is preparing for something. And for a young person on a sport development journey, you would like to think that they're spending 99.9% of their life in that sort of space. But the reality is, whenever you go and compete at whatever level, whatever standard, you get some of that stuff around. So that's just one way of thinking about it.
That's fascinating. It's really good. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time. I could talk to you about this stuff all day. It's really interesting. I hope people get 1 or 2 things there, because it's just some really clear ways of thinking. I love the better way of looking at marginal gains from someone who was there from the beginning. That the idea of the process is something that, when you have a process performance plan with a clear goal, that's the right kind of goal for you. I think some of the questions around how do you prioritize what to do all falls out in the wash, doesn't it? That's the goal that I'm trying to do, that's mostly in my control. Therefore, all I need to do is this. I don't need to worry about all this other stuff, because all this other stuff isn't going to help me achieve that goal. And that you go from not having to, I don't know what to prioritize. I've worked out what my goal is, and now the priorities have sorted themselves out.
There still is a bit of an art to that. And that's where having a network of mentors and other experienced people can guide you. The decision still with you. In your case, you're going to race. You're still trying to make a decision. And that's okay. Because as I say, you just got to realize, if you knew what the outcome was, you just do it. And you're trying to figure those things out. And the language I sort of use is trying to navigate that uncertainty. That's what you're constantly trying to do. And it isn't, as you say, every young person I saw, if I could predict whether they were going to become a professional or Olympic athlete, God, I'd be a billion trillionaire. I don't. And many people don't. They'll see what's in front of them. And that journey's, every performance journey or everything you do, it's non-linear, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. So you just have to accept that is it and be comfortable with that. And then you just say, you put everything in place to at least manage those things you can control. And off you go. Have some fun. Remember why you're doing it.
I think that's a great way to finish, because it is about having fun, particularly as something that is. So whilst we were talking about this professional approach, one of my previous guests was like, look, this is the approach and the professional way of going about doing it. But if at any point this crosses a line from fun to a job or a chore, you need to have another think about it, because the outcome that we're trying to get here is about fun and enjoyment. That hopefully will help a lot of people.
Even if you go and read the autobiographies of a number of people who've been amazingly successful in sport, often a common theme comes through. They just love what they do. There is a circus now. Why would the Brownlees in there, when they're peakiest, just want to go and put the 30 odd hours in a week, every week, run it, beautiful area in the Peak District, cycling, riding, running, swimming. At that level, there is a monotony to it. There is a need to do the basics repeatedly. But the bottom line, you take all the circus away that is in and around high level sport. I think there was a great quote. I remember when Egan Bernal won the Tour de France, and there's a question to him about the pressure. He said, pressure. He says, I love the adrenaline. I love the racing. So you take away all of that. That's what they thrive on. And I think I'm just remembering that sometimes. Why am I here? If it becomes that unhealthy pressure, especially when you're racing at a younger amateur level, you got to question why you're doing it. And I think that's the important thing always to go back to. And let me assure you, people at the very top, you strip away that circus. That'll be the reason why they do. You hear that come through. I watch some F1. I'm not, a massive fan. I don't particularly understand it. But I think that comes through from Lewis Hamilton. And I think that's the thing for all of us.
Honestly, that's a great way to finish. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, Scott.
Great. No worries. Good. I hope the audience enjoy it. Thanks, Samir.
How absolutely fascinating to have Scott on the show. Someone who's been at the absolute inner circle, the centre of some of these amazing sporting achievements over the last few years. the way he emphasises the conversations, not just the tactics of the Marginal Gains philosophy, is something I really hope you picked up on there. Again, linking to some of the previous guests, we're talking about the why we're doing something, not only what we're doing to improve. Blindly copying your competitors isn't going to get you what you want, but it's hard sometimes to see the wood for the trees. I hope hearing that from the horse's mouth from someone who's been involved in such success over the years in the world of Olympic and professional sports will give you confidence to really step back and have another think about why it is you're doing and what are the small things that you can do to try and improve your chances and your performance. It was a real honour to have him on the show, and I hope you enjoyed listening to what he had to say. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.